Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session on reducing methane emissions in the food sector. I'm Simi Thambi. I'm going to be your moderator for today. I'm the climate economist at FAIR Initiative. FAIR is a global investor network. We work on creating awareness about the risks and opportunities in the global food sector. Now, just to set the baseline here, it's 5:15, and I know most of us must be very tired. And so our conversations today are going to be honest. We're going to talk to you about, we have some really great experts here who are going to give you insights from their areas of work. To get some of the facts out there, we have, a couple of facts about methane emissions, which is, of course, it's a highly powerful global warming gas, up to 27 to 28 times the warming potential than carbon dioxide. It's a short-lived gas, live around just about for 12 years. And agriculture is one of the biggest sources of emissions of methane gas. So by the end of this session, if we could understand what are some of the key challenges in addressing methane gas, particularly in the food sector, if all of us could improve our understanding on that, I think that would be a significant success for all of us panelists and for me as the moderator and definitely for the hosts. So with that, what I'm going to do is we have a video which will take a deeper look into why should we focus on methane. So let's play the video, Tim.
We're busy people, but we need to talk. Yes, the gas. Yes, that gas. And its role in the biggest threat to public health, climate change. While carbon dioxide gets all the blame for packing heat, methane is a close rival. Though dwarfed by the amount of CO2, it's 80 times more powerful, behind 30% of our climate woes. Not only that, but the inhalation of methane's toxic co-pollutants and the ozone it helps produce keeps us even busier. While CO2 stays in the atmosphere for centuries, methane only lasts around a decade. But methane emissions are growing, double pre-industrial concentrations. Even if we stopped all CO2 production today, methane emissions would still mean we pass 1.5 degrees warming, and we think we're busy now. So where does this methane come from? Livestock, manure and bad land management create huge amounts of methane, as do landfill sites where our waste rots. And significantly, fossil fuel production releases massive methane emissions. So how do we get off our gases? Firstly, the easy fixes, like getting fossil fuel companies to stop leakage, then replacing coal, oil and gas with renewable energy, moving to low-meat, plant-rich diets, and using food and agri-waste as compost as part of a circular economy. All this could reduce human-caused methane by up to 45% within the next decade and avert 0.3 degrees Celsius of temperature rise by 2045, giving the world a little more breathing space, better health, and a first easy win against climate change. Leaving us a little less busy.
Wasn't that an interesting video? So with that, let me just maybe hand over to my wonderful panelists and maybe give you maybe a minute or so to give us a quick introduction about you and also the organization that you work for. First, Reese.
Okay. Thank you so much, Simi. And thank you so much for the Spain Pavilion for organizing this panel today. My name is Reyes Tirado. I'm Agri-Food Lead in Climate Bonds Initiative, and I lead the work developing criteria and standards for green investments.
Good afternoon. My name is Milion Belay. I'm the General Coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. The Alliance is the biggest alliance in Africa. It's an alliance of farmers, fisher folks, pastoralists, indigenous peoples, women, youth, faith-based institutions, civil society organizations, almost everybody. We work in 50 of the 55 African countries, mainly to contribute to the transition of African agriculture to agroecology. Thank you.
That's a great segue, because I also come from an alliance. My name is Milena Sergeyeva. I'm the liaison officer for Latin America and the Caribbean of the Global Climate and Health Alliance. We are an alliance of health professional and health-focused organizations that work to minimize the climate impacts on health and also to maximize the opportunities that exist in climate action for health.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Now, can I request Reese maybe to give a short presentation? The Greenpeace Foundation recently launched a fantastic report, and Reese is going to tell us a little bit about it. Over to you, Reese.
Thank you, Simi. Can you hear me well? Yes. So, I recently collaborated on a report by Greenpeace Nordic that is called Turning Down the Heat, Pulling the Emergency Brake on Big Meat and Dairy with a focus on methane. I'm being co-author in this report in modeling some of the temperature, hopeful stories around temperature that we can extract from changing the meat and dairy business. So I want to start by just saying why food is important, and meat and dairy are key for a safer climate. Food systems as a whole emit between 21 and 37% of global greenhouse gases. And from that, meat and dairy production globally account for up to 19% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Methane, the methane that comes from livestock, is the largest source of methane globally. So imagine that we could slow the pace of warming by working on this superheater gas that is methane. And why methane is a superheater? We've seen some of it in the video. Methane is 80 times more powerful than CO2 in warming in the short term, in 20 years, and 27 times more warming than CO2 over 100 years. But it's also short-lived, so it disappears in the atmosphere in about 12 years. So if we keep emitting methane, we are accelerating the warming. However, because methane is special, it can also have a cooling effect on warming. So it can reduce it does not reduce the temperature, but it can reduce the increase in temperature. So this is why Greenpeace is calling this pulling the climate emergency brake to slow down temperature rise. In this study, what we did, we wanted to create some stories, so modeling stories, what will happen if we continue with business as usual with livestock, following the FAO scenario that is showing us that there's going to be an increase in meat and dairy production and consumption globally of 52%. So what consequence this will have for temperature? We also had two other scenarios that were hopeful. So one is going for a less meat and dairy production and consumption only in high and middle income countries. And then we have a third scenario that is going for this low meat and dairy production and consumption in all countries in the world. So remember, business as usual, going for a healthy diet in high and middle income countries, and going for a healthy diet everywhere. So this is based on a study by Casey Ivanovich, published in Nature Climate Change last year, and we had collaborated a lot. Now she is a postdoc at NASA. She was before in Columbia University, and we have collaborated to do this modeling. So the first result from the business as usual. So what we measure was, okay, we increase meat and dairy production and consumption up to 2050. What is the consequence this has on increasing temperature? The consequence is that it will be a warming of 0.32 degrees by 2050, only accountable for this increase in meat and dairy. Then we also looked into how much of this is coming from methane. And what we can say is that 80% of this warming is actually related to methane because of this powerful effect it has in the short term and because of the short life it has on the atmosphere. And you might wonder if this 0.32 is important. And the answer is yes. because as you know, we're here because we want to keep the warming below 1.5. The difference between 1.5 and 2 is immense, but even one fraction of a degree, so for example 0.1, has a very important effect on the stability of the planet. And for example, there's been some recent modeling showing that if we prevent just 0.1 degrees Celsius of warming, we can avoid 2% of glaciers melting. Or if we prevent 0.3 degrees of warming, we could reduce the number of people exposed to heat extremes in 410 million people. So these small fractions of degree do have a very important effect on the planet and on humanity. Now going into the hopeful projection. So the projection is we adopt, if the world in only middle and high income countries adopt a healthy diet, one that is aligned with the planetary healthy diet by the Eat Lancet Commission, what will happen basically is we'll roughly cut in half meat and dairy production and consumption by 2050. So this is also in line with a report we did, I co-author also in 2018 with Greenpeace that is called the Less is More report, and it's based on this idea that we can shrink and share. So we can reduce in one side meat and dairy in the rich countries, but also we can share some of that production with the societies and the regions where still there's a need to increase animal protein production and consumption. So, the hopeful projection. What will happen if we go to this healthy diet in high and middle income countries? The answer is that we can avoid a warming of 37% compared to the business as usual. So instead of warming 0.32 degrees, the warming will be reduced by 0.12. So it's a quite big reduction, and as I said, this can be related to less melting of glaciers, less people exposed to deadly heat, and so on and so forth. So really, it's a very significant effect from just going to a healthier diet. Also, another hopeful fact comes from modeling 3. So when we look at all countries, also including the low-income countries, the difference is not so big, meaning that the reduction in emissions could be, not in emissions, in temperature, could be 39%. So the warming will be reduced by 0.13. So instead of 0.12, it's 0.13. So if we focus only on the overconsumption parts of society and countries in high and middle income, we can get a very significant effect in reductions of warming without affecting the ability of low-income countries to develop and to even produce more livestock if needed. So this is why cutting meat and dairy can be an emergency brake on warming. Was today on a few panels talking about this report by the World Bank, Recipes for a Livable Planet. And it's very important because they analyze different mitigation options in different countries, and they also recognize that dietary shifts, particularly in overconsumption countries, is a very important mitigation option, much higher than other technical approaches that could be approached. The second part of the report talks about what are the drivers on this increasing in meat and dairy production and consumption, and look at the companies. The livestock sector is very concentrated. The power is really concentrated in a handful of companies. And for example, JBS, which is the world's largest producer of meat, accounts alone by itself up to 9%, between 7 and 9% of all cattle slaughtered worldwide. And the 20 largest dairy producers account for a quarter of all the milk that is processed worldwide. So there's a large concentration of power, there's a large concentration of responsibility, which brings a large concentration of opportunities to really change this. So the report also looked into how these methane emissions from the meat and dairy sector compare to methane from the fossil fuel majors, from the biggest fossil fuel companies worldwide. And they analyzed 29 companies, and really compared to those companies in fossil fuel, meat and dairy companies come very close to the top. For example, JBS would be the 5th company below only Gazprom and other big oil companies in terms of methane emissions. So JBS alone emits more methane than Shell and ExxonMobil together. So it's really quite impressive, the amount of methane that comes from meat and dairy. And for example, other companies like Cargill, Dairy Farmers of America, Minerva, Marfrig, and JBS together are higher in emissions or very similar in emissions to the combination of BP, Total Energies, Shell, Chevron, and ExxonMobil. So it's really a sector that we also need to decarbonize as soon as possible. I just want to end saying that there's a need for regulation from governments in terms of this sector that is highly unregulated at the moment. And it's important that to set targets that differentiate between different gases and really look at methane as an important gas that needs action in the short term. And I would just add that in my role in climate bonds, we are developing criteria and standards to focus into where those interventions, where are the biggest opportunities for interventions within the agriculture production sector, including livestock, to decarbonize. And one of those interventions that we have in the criteria right now that are eligible for labeling as green, so labeling as green bonds, for example, is around transitioning income in farming communities towards less animal herds. So it's one of those interventions that are really very important for mitigation and very important going forward. So I will leave it there and just looking forward to your questions later on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Louise. We don't have the presentation today, but if anyone is interested in reading the report, I really encourage you to go to the website and please download the report. Now, 3 particular points really stuck to me, like some of the biggest companies are emitting as much methane as some of the biggest meat companies are emitting as much methane as some of the biggest oil and gas sector. Now, that is a big statement to make, right? But when we think about what are the actions that these companies are doing, you'll be surprised it's not much. For instance, at Fair Initiative, we analyzed some of the targets that these companies have set for methane, and we find that not many have actually set targets to reduce methane emissions. Very few are actually accounting for methane emissions. So there is definitely, an appetite there to, report more on methane emissions. And the other interesting thing that I found as part of your presentation, Reese, was something around diets. I think the point around diets, the difference in the diet between high income and middle countries and rest of the world, and then looking at it with that lens was something very, very interesting because overconsumption of these kind of products is not necessarily a global phenomena. It's happening in certain parts of the world, and therefore I think that's a wonderful segue for Milena to you to step in and tell us a little bit about the reports that you've published, particularly around this issue.
Thanks so much, and congratulations on the report. Once again, it confirms why at the Global Climate and Health Alliance we needed to look into methane and how it impacts health. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So the video you saw in the beginning was produced last year to accompany the launch of 3 reports on methane in every methane production sector, energy, food systems, and waste. And they were addressed to our constituency, which are doctors and nurses, public health professionals, who work to minimize climate impacts in health and optimize the solutions that are solutions for climate to bring the biggest benefits for health as well. So there was a study by the Lancet Countdown that modeled the full implementation of the Paris Agreement and looked into populations of 9 countries that have big populations like Brazil, India, the United States, and others, and calculated the lives saved in three key sectors, by policies in three key sectors. So the energy sector, obviously related to air pollution, policies related to diminishing air pollution, also the transport sector, which are policies that promote active transportation, walkable, cyclable cities, and of course the agriculture sector. And the policy was related to reduction of meat consumption. And we know that air pollution is breathed by 99% of world population, but for our surprise, the most lives were saved by healthier diets with reduced meat consumption and more based on plants. So we needed to look what's behind that, and of course, this is also linked to reduced land use change, reduced deforestation, reduced exposure to wildfire smoke. We now in the Latin American region, we've seen increasing wildfire seasons, prolonged, and smoke reaching cities where millions and millions of people live. And this is related to cattle ranching and expanding the agricultural land for heavy monoculture and turning the Amazon into a savanna, basically. And so it is something that concerns doctors and nurses and public health professionals and has hugely impacted health. And I want to return to your point about every fraction of degree matters. It is so important for health too. So I will leave the others to comment.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point made there. That when we, and that's the Global Climate and Health Alliance, doctors and nurses putting across the point that when we look at air pollution and overconsumption, overconsumption can be a bigger health concern. So that's a really big takeaway. What about you, Milen? Does overconsumption ring a bell in the area that you work in? Is it applicable? And what is the local context that we must be aware of?
I think question of overproduction of meat and overconsumption of meat in our context is not yet an issue in an African context. If you're asking me about the direction that we are going to, maybe there is a concern there. But as I speak now, whether the issue of methane is a problem or not, I think it's not a problem. If it is a problem, it's a minute problem in our context. But we are, the climate crisis is a global crisis. Whatever happens in North is, creates crisis in our part of the world. So we can join the campaign against the increase in methane in other parts of the continent, not in our continent right now. Because the problem is different now, If we are talking about health, you're talking about the amount of egg that people are eating and the amount of meat that people are getting. That can be health concern in terms of nutrition, as I speak.
So that's another interesting point. Like at least in the African continent, it's not really, it's not really come up very much in discussions. One thing that I heard in a panel earlier today was related to the Danish government imposing the carbon tax, particularly for the livestock sector. So, of course, there are a group of countries that are recognizing that it is a problem, and when a significant share of their national emissions come from agriculture sector, it's important to tackle that. And that's a fantastic step in the right direction. So there are governments working in the right direction. What about the finance community? And what about, how is the private sector really taking steps in this direction? Reese, maybe enlighten us a little bit based on your work.
Thank you, Simi. So yes, it's an interesting question, difficult one, because on one side, I think there's interest to put more transitional finance into this sector, and it attracts a lot of attention. For example, going into, for example, deforestation-free sourcing and conversion-free sourcing. So there's a lot of investors' interest in making sure that the investments are not contributing to deforestation. Not related directly to livestock, but very much indirectly, because we know that 85% of the deforestation happening in mostly tropical countries is related to the expansion of agriculture, often for feed production for animals. So in Brazil, for example, and maybe in some places in Africa also, that expansion is not related directly to the production of livestock there, but is related to the production of livestock in other places. So deforestation is kind of the first precondition for any transition in this sector, including on financing. So when we are developing, for example, criteria for investments within the agriculture sector, the agri-food system, we start with deforestation precondition, so sourcing that is free of deforestation, and that attracts attention. Then we also looking, and you know this very well, we're looking into not only financial instruments like for green bonds or transition pathways, transition plans for crop and farming producers, but also for the substitution of some of these animal proteins. And we are developing at the moment an alternative protein criteria that really tries and is attracting a lot of attention from the sector, because it's a sector that really wants to scale up big. It's attracting many investments already from some development banks, and it's something where there's opportunity for growth for those wanting to substitute some of these very damaging livestock production with other types of alternative protein production.
I think that's a very useful point to make there, and particularly the point that you made around feed and livestock, the intricate relation. We've also done some work using integrated assessment models, and some of our findings point to the fact that many of these biggest livestock companies can face a huge cost increase from feed related costs, such as increase in maize prices, particularly in North American region. So that comes out very strongly because the Midwest of the United States is subject to droughts, and a lot of the corn or maize is grown in that region. Corn is fed to livestock, and so it's a big, intricate, complex chain there. Would any of you like to add to some of the comments made here, or perhaps maybe Milena, you wanted to add something?
Well, yes, thinking about our health systems right now, they're making us sick. One of every 10 deaths is actually due to unhealthy diet. And with the projections of the population rise, the need for food production also rises. And so it is a very good moment to be thinking how we're going to transform this food system so that we eat a healthier diet. And the use of pesticides, the use of fertilizers, antibiotics, all of this increases in a climate reality and climate crisis. So when looking into methane, we could also explore all of the rest of the sector and see how we transform it and transition into more healthier life. So it's a real opportunity. And I know that different contexts demand different solutions, and we need to think about a diet that is not only sustainable, but also culturally appropriate and nutritious and adequate for every little community.
There are also a lot of wonderful initiatives taking place, right? For instance, we saw the Global Methane Pledge that was signed by several countries, and it's supposed to take us in the right direction. Any views on, are we on track? What more can be done, particularly from your unique perspectives, medical and, agroecology and criteria and finance? Anything to add there?
From the perspective of public health, we need climate action urgently. Really, this is what we're calling for, because the climate crisis is a health crisis. Every fraction of the warming matters. And so that's what we need. We need urgent finance to fund action in developing countries. We need the loss and damage fund, very much functionable, operational. We are here to support the demands for climate action with our health voice.
Fantastic. Reese.
I would like to add something on the Global Methane Pledge because, yes, I think it was a very good initiative that started in Glasgow. So it put methane on the spotlight. However, and I think it's very important for on the oil and gas sector, for example, that, you know, my colleague Ana Diaz is here, who is developing some work on that also in terms of how the oil and gas sector can really cut a lot of those methane with very little cost or even no cost and saving. So that's like a given. And that's the focus of most of the methane pledge, which is good. But agriculture is kind of the little child there. So it's like, it's voluntary actions, mostly going into some techno fixes, but not really addressing the elephant in the room, which is the need to really transform the agri-food system in one that is not so reliant on overproduction and consumption of animal protein. So the Global Methane Pledge, yes, but it needs to address agri-food, and in this case, livestock production with an agri-food system perspective, thinking into transformation and thinking into shifting, transition, some of that income, also in developing countries, not depending on deforestation and investing a lot more on agroecology. And I think this is where Million has a lot of experience and amazing work in Africa with his alliance in promoting a different type of agriculture that is not so reliant on overconsumption of chemicals or depleting the soil, deforesting, but really working with nature and working with the local communities to provide food security for everybody. So, yeah.
Million, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I think the source of the problem is separating animals from the system and growing them, you know? That's what has created this crisis to begin with. Animals were always part of the system, you know, part of the agricultural system. So agroecology promotes the synergy that is created among the different parts of the system, including livestock. So livestock are part of the system. Whatever is produced from livestock is used to improve the soil, improve productivity, improve health, and build resilience. In a pastoralist system is also a very, very productive system. In a pastoralist system is important in keeping the landscape thriving. You know, that's a system that is proved and grown for a long time in living with the ecosystem. So the livestock sector in the pastoral system is a very healthy system. Whenever you remove the livestock, then a problem comes, you know. That's what is agroecology promoting, both in the pastoral system and also in the agricultural system. They have to be there. The moment you separate them and grow them together, that's, you know, you have to do quite a lot of things, antibiotics, and you know, different mechanisms, and it's very difficult even to treat what is coming out of their body, because purpose is to grow them as fast as possible, and that's what is creating a problem. So, yeah, we're happy with the methane pledge, and as usual, a pledge is one thing, and implementing is another. Thank you.
I think that's really the point here, right? How are we really implementing the global methane pledge, and is there any, information source that can actually update us on the progress? At least from the corporate perspective, that's an area that FAIR works on, and I would love to, reiterate this point and again. We would like more companies disclosing on, methane, and we see that, dairy companies definitely are setting dairy targets, like methane reduction targets. We saw that announcement made at the COP last year. Many dairy companies said that they will start reporting their methane emissions, which was a fantastic step. We need more such companies reporting on their methane emissions. We need more companies setting targets for methane emissions. FAIR initiative, as I already mentioned, we looked at 60 of the biggest listed companies. Only about 5 have targets on methane emissions, which is really a surprising number. So we need some of these big corporations to start monitoring it. And there can be numerous excuses, right? But if the leaders wouldn't do it, then, how will we progress? So that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges, as you said, implementation on the ground, looking at it from an agroecology perspective. One interesting thing that comes to my mind, Million, we were having this conversation earlier. It's important to look at the switch, right? Because you mentioned like when sometimes the pastoralists struggle with land grabbing, which is quite common in the African continent. Some of these big companies grab the lands of these pastoralists and then, use it for monocropping. So it's actually moving away from methane to nitrous oxide, which is even more potent because the amount of fertilizers that go into that. So could you tell us a little bit more about that from the African perspective?
Yeah, in Africa, the pastoralist land is under attack. In the guise of producing more food, more and more pastoral lands are taken from the people because it's not registered in people's name. And because of that, it's considered as terra nullius, So in what they are planting there is one kind of crop. And when it is monocrop, you usually use artificial fertilizers, which are mostly nitrogen-based, and also pesticides. And these are much more greenhouse gases than even methane. So yeah, it's exacerbating from one system which actually contributes to the survival of that ecosystem to another system which actually degrades the ecosystem and also adds to the greenhouse gas crisis.
So it's a vicious cycle. Yeah. And I also realize we have about 10 minutes, and I know the audience has been really patient, and I want to open up the floor to our audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Fantastic. Can we have your name and also the organization that you affiliate with?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm called Musa Usman Dapa. I'm a pastoralist from Cameroon. My organization is called Boskuda. It's an NGO with United Nations consultative status since 2009 and also an observer status with the UN FCC since 2023. Okay, my question, but before I go to my question, let me make some comment. The comment I want to make is that we pastoralists from Africa, you need to know that our livelihood depends on livestock keeping and keeping them in a more traditional manner. And I believe, and very strongly as well, that we have very strong traditional knowledge that have sustained the life we live and the land we live and the ecosystem we live and the biodiversity more than what the narrative the scientists are bringing on the table. Because I think comparatively, if you look at the areas occupied, run by indigenous people, and those ones that are occupied are run by the so-called modern agriculture or modern technology, the difference is vast because the land unused by traditional people are still very much intact. So my worry is that some of us, 80% of our population their livelihood depends on livestock keeping. And we know In Africa, for example, Africa as a whole does not produce more than 5% of the greenhouse gas emission. Am I right? And why should we then criminalize livestock sector because of methane production that does not produce 5% in Africa? Okay. And my question I want to ask you in particular, from Greenpeace, don't you ask the scientists or those who produce the report, can we find other method or means to neutralize the methane, for example? Are there some research to do on that rather than telling us to eat meat from tensile meat, for example? I heard last year in Dubai, they were asking us or introducing tensile meat or plant-based diet. Okay, but can we find a research to turn the methane around? Okay, but
maybe
the last thing I want to say, this might not concern Africa in the context. For example, when I was in Europe or America, I become vegetarian because I don't eat meat in Europe because the meat does not taste the way I can eat meat. I can only eat meat if I'm in Africa.
That's a very
I think, Reese, if you could answer that question, and thank you for the question.
Thank you so much for raising this point. And I have to say that I very much agree with you. And the whole basis of the report is actually very much differentiating between big meat and dairy producers and big. I'll wait for you to put it. Can put it? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yes.
Fantastic.
Great. I want to say thank you for the question. And I also want to say that I very much agree with you into that pastoralist and big meat, dairy, what we call industrial or intensive livestock production, they're very, very different systems. And what we are focusing on, by no means we want to criminalize pastoralists or livestock producers as a whole. That's why we're making this distinction in the modeling, and always, in the work we do in climate bonds, we're also distinguishing very much between smallholders and big producers who have different responsibility and different opportunities to put funds into the solutions. What I want to say very specifically also is that the solutions applied to pastoralists, to pastures, are very different to the solutions you can apply to big livestock operations that are intensive in one place, mostly without land, promoting a lot of deforestation sometimes because they need to bring large amount of feed from places like the Amazon or the Cerrado in Brazil, for example. So they're very, very different systems. And what I want to end saying is that there's carbon disclosure of the different gases is very important. And one reason why is because pastoralists, depending on the animals they keep, can have some methane emissions. So it's important that we know, not pastoralists, but we know where gases are coming from. So companies are disclosing there are methane emissions, there are nitrous oxide emissions. But in the case of pastoralists, there's also carbon sequestration in the soil sometimes, if the practices are right. Often, those pastoralists are also very important for keeping biodiversity. So when we talk about the different gases, methane is important, but it's important that pastoralists in many pastures also are able to sequester carbon in the soil. And sometimes this is cancelling out. There was a recent study showing that if you keep about 1 head of cattle per hectare, your carbon sequestration with good practices would cancel out the methane. But this cannot be used as an excuse for big livestock producers not to do nothing about the methane they are emitting. They're very different systems, and we need to understand this nuance to be really able to keep the action and the responsibility and the opportunity also for investments with those that have the biggest potential to act.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
a wonderful segue to actually conclude this segment, because it's very important to keep these nuances in mind, as we heard from the pastoralist, as we heard, from Reese and the other panelists, Milena and Million here. It's very important to keep the nuances in mind when we think about reducing the global methane emissions. With that, thank you so much for your patience. We hope you enjoyed this session. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.